Last week, the Masson was our focus, a Danish machine gun that proved not only to be one of the most reliable, but one that stood the test of time as well. Still likely in use today, somewhere down in South America. Today though, we're looking at something similarly long-standing, a weapon so iconic, its name is known across the world. This week on Battlefield 1 Weapon History, we're going to be looking at the British Lee Enfield rifle. And as with each episode in this series, before we get stuck into the history, which is indeed very interesting, we're going to be taking a look at the weapon in Battlefield 1. The short magazine Lee Enfield, or to give it its proper in-game name, the SMLE Mark III, is available to the Scout class, and its 3 variants cost 200 war bonds apiece for you to unlock. The 3 variants, the Infantry, Carbine and Marksman, as they're named differently, are all suited to different scenarios, but they do cover off mainly the aggressive playstyle, with the SMLE offering a good set of statistics that really holds its own against the semi and fully automatic weapons in this game. Its standout feature though, across all of the variants, is without a doubt its ability to hold 10 rounds at a time, compared to most other bolt actions which come with a maximum of just 5. This is an integral part of the SMLE's design, which we'll get into later on. To aid its aggressive nature along with those 10 bullets, the SMLE takes advantage of Battlefield 1's sweet spot mechanic, doing a minimum of 80 damage up close, but maxing out to 100 damage between 40 and 75 meters range. This is an ideal distance if you're a player who likes to rush an objective, because here you can hit any part of the upper body and land a kill shot. This makes it an extremely effective weapon when you're working the outskirts of an area. Most of your enemies are likely to be within that sweet spot range, so there's no need to follow up with a second shot or switch to a sidearm. Of the 3 variants on offer, I'd say this one is one of the rifles in Battlefield 1 where I'd recommend the variants without a sight. The infantry and the carbine options really do offer some power for close quarters engagements. It gives you a fairly unobstructed view, and it allows you to take advantage of the good rates of fire and the extra bullets before having to reload. Now, the marksman can be useful if you want to extend out to longer ranges, but really the sweet spot favours close to medium range use, so it's not really an option that I'd go for. You'd be better off using another rifle with a sweet spot of greater distance to get your one-shot kills out there. The infantry variant does offer faster recoil and spread decrease over the carbine, but with it being a bolt action, in between shots you'll have to rechamber a round anyway, and you won't always follow up instantly the moment you're about to fire. The carbine does have the advantage with hipfire accuracy, but again, unless you land a headshot in close range, that kind of statistic is really not very useful anyway. There is, of course, one rather special SMLE in Battlefield 1, the T.E. Lawrence rifle. This comes as part of the early enlisted deluxe edition of the game, and it seems to follow the same statistical path as the infantry variant. We'll talk more about this particular rifle later on in the video. But have DICE modelled the SMLE in Battlefield 1 after its real-life self, or have they taken some creative liberties along the way? Is it equivalent, or have the rules been bent a little bit to create something that will fit into a video game? Let's find out. First of all then, let's take a look at how the short magazine Lee Enfield came to be. Designed in the late 1890s, it superseded earlier rifles, the Martini Henry, we all know that one, the Martini Enfield, and it was actually based on the Lee Metford rifle, and it was more of a redesign of that weapon than anything else. Its name comes firstly from the designer of the rifle's bolt system, James Paris Lee, and the original factory in which it was developed, RSAF Enfield. After its initial construction, subsequent models featured this blunt nose design, which was actually modelled off of another weapon at the time, the Swedish Model 1894, also referred to as the Swedish Mauser. This blunted nose became an iconic feature of the rifle and is now unmistakably a point on this weapon that people really remember. Deployment of the first rifle, the magazine Lee Enfield, or the MLE, began in 1895 into the British military. This first model featured a much longer barrel and chambered the .303 British cartridge, a cartridge that would stay put in this weapon throughout its life. The rifle was also fairly modern for its time, featuring a 10-round detachable magazine underneath the weapon. This allowed the infantryman to hold double the ammunition of other rifles in use of the day, a huge advantage during combat, not needing to reload the weapon as often as your enemy. Its inclusion on the weapon, though, was initially opposed by some members of the British military. Some were wary that soldiers in battle might end up losing the magazine. As a solution to this, many of the original Lee Enfield rifles were fitted with a short metal chain attached to the magazine to keep them from being separated. Various tweaks were made to the original design, the shortening of the barrel, the blunted nose, the ability to load the weapon from a charger, and in 1904, the SMLE Mark I was introduced, the original short magazine Lee Enfield, the start of the more iconic designs of the weapon. The barrel was now nearly half the length of the original model, which became a little bit of a sticking point. Many rifle associations and gunsmiths had concerns the shorter barrel would make the weapon overall vastly less accurate compared to previous models. They also believed the recoil from the shorter barrel would be too great to use the weapon in combat, but those fears turned out to be unfounded. In January 1907, the Mark III SMLE was introduced. Now this is the model that we see in Battlefield 1. Various improvements to the sights, charger, handguards and magazine were made, along with an upgrade to allow the weapon to fire a newer round, the high-velocity .303 Spitzer. Now this new round was much more aerodynamic, it could reach higher speeds, and it was more accurate than the previous bullet. That one featured a more rounded design at the tip, and the Spitzer was just pointy. The picture on the screen now shows you the difference, and basically the Lee Enfield was upgraded to fire a round that looks something like what you know a bullet to look like today. But back then, this was a big technological advancement. Now all of these improvements to the rifle rather obviously increased the complexity of production for the weapon, and therefore it increased the cost of each unit. To help combat this, some of the older models were upgraded to mimic the improvements of the Mark III, but by the time the First World War broke out and hit full swing, in 1915, demand for the rifle was outstripping the supply. The fact that the main three manufacturers of weaponry for the British military couldn't keep up at the time led to the rifle being contracted out to other smaller companies, and at the same time the decision was taken to remove some of the less imperative features of the weapon, and that was to reduce the cost. The subsequent Mark III asterisk, I think, was born, but most of these weapons still had the odd feature that was supposed to have been removed. This was due to the different factories being told at different times that these features no longer needed to be on the weapon. These two models, the Mark III and the Mark III asterisk, were the most common during World War I, and they were held in very high regard due to their reliability and speed of fire. There are several accounts that state German soldiers were forced to retreat after launching an attack, thinking they'd been hit with machine gun fire, when in fact it was groups of well-trained British servicemen firing several Lee Enfield rifles all at the same time. This action is called the Mad Minute. It's performed by British soldiers where they could fire between 20 and 30 rounds in under a minute from a bolt-action rifle. That made the Lee Enfield the fastest bolt-action rifle of the day. Now, other rifles could theoretically have fired faster, but none of them had the reliability and the access to a 10-round magazine. Now, very briefly, I want to talk about a very special unit of the Lee Enfield. It's what's known as the T.E. Lawrence rifle, and it's the very unit owned and used by Lawrence of Arabia. This is one of the Mark III rifles produced from 1907 onwards, so pretty much the full Monty Lee Enfield at the time, and was given to Lawrence by Emir Faisal, the then king of the Arab Kingdom. It was actually one of the many rifles captured at Gallipoli during a failed campaign by the British to overrun the Ottoman Empire. The Turks gave the rifle to the Emir, who then gifted it to Lawrence. He then used the rifle for the rest of the war whilst he was in Arabia, and even engraved his initials and the date into the weapon. The date is thought to be the date he was given it by the Emir. Now, after the war ended and Lawrence returned home to Britain, he presented that weapon to King George V. The Arabic engraving on the metal of the weapon is almost identical to the weapon in Battlefield 1, and that shows DICE really did their homework on this weapon. I thought I'd include that. It's a special story about a very special Lee Enfield rifle. After World War I, the Lee Enfield saw much more action into the 20th century. In 1926, the whole series of weapons was renamed, and the rifle number 1 was born. During the Second World War, it saw service among the British and Commonwealth forces. Australia and India kept the original Mark III as their standard issue rifle during World War II, and Australia kept it in service until the late 1950s, when it was finally replaced by the L1A1. The Mark III Asterisk model was altered by India in their rifle factory in Ishapur, and the Model 2A was born. The thumbnail of this video actually shows an Ishapur rifle. I couldn't find any shots that I wanted to use of the standard Lee Enfield, and here's a colorized version of that picture. The rifle number 4, another variant of the Lee Enfield, was adopted into British service in 1941, being supplied to many British soldiers during the Second World War. It was a much heavier rifle due to a heavier barrel and a new bayonet, which was nicknamed the Pig Sticker. Not only that, but a new sight system was developed and implemented on this weapon as well, making it faster and more accurate than any sights offered on any Mauser weapons or the 1903 Springfield. Various other models were produced, and really it'd take me all day to go through them, but there are still some cool mentions out there of the Lee Enfield, designed in the 1890s, and many of its models thereafter is still in use today. Most notably, the Canadian Rangers, a component of the Armed Reserve Forces in Canada, are still using the weapons. Officially, it's been stated that many of the weapons have now been retired due to the lack of parts, but there's still no official confirmation that all of them have been taken out of service. They've been using the number 4 Mark I rifle produced in the early 1940s. Now, Captain Mark Rittage, officer commander of the 3rd Canadian Patrol, is quoted as saying this about the Lee Enfield. The Rangers were not issued this weapon to fight an enemy. They were given the rifle because they are operating in one of the harshest environments in the world. This weapon was given to them because it's indestructible. In any condition regardless, this weapon will fire. As long as that round gets chambered, it will fire. It will also bring down anything it hits at 550 meters. Because it uses a 303, it has the stopping power. Far across the other side of the world, in 2012, Lee Enfields were still being used against NATO forces by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And during a civil war in Nepal in the late 90s and early 2000s, Mark III Lee Enfields were issued to government troops fighting against rebel forces. The Lee Enfield saw a truly great history with the British Empire, the British forces, its colonies, and even its rare use today. The replication of its features on the Mark III model into Battlefield 1 are clearly present, with not much room for error either. Personally, the work DICE did to get the T.E. Lawrence rifle into the game is, I think, most noteworthy here. A true testament to something that really played a historically important role in the war. And there we go, that's the Lee Enfield. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think of that weapon down in the comments below, and let me know what weapon you want to be featured next on Battlefield 1 Weapon History. But until next time, my name is Westie, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.